Thank you for this introduction. And now we are going back to basics and the beginnings of agriculture. So how did everything that we are talking about here started? So our story begins in the Fertile Crescent, which is the territory of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Southeast Turkey. And as you can see here on the slide over here, it looks like a crescent. So that is why it is called Fertile Crescent, because in this territory, the fields of wild cereals grew. Those fields of wild Near Eastern cereals, which are wheat, barley, oats, and rye, everything that we use in our traditional cooking practices even today. And in this territory, also wild sheep and goats lived that were one of crucial part of the domestication process and the Neolithic package that I'm going to talk about just in a minute. So this is the where everything started, where Neolithic was formed. And the oldest evidence for wild cereal consumption goes back to 23,000 years ago, and it was found at the site of Ohala II in Israel. So ever since the 23,000 years ago, people started experimenting with cereals and started seeing that those wild grasses had some grains that can be used in their diet. So that process of the cereal domestication and the domestication of animals lasted for several thousand years. So it was an extremely slow process. And in this territory, everything happened. So Neolithic package is a term that we as archaeologists use to describe all the innovations that happened during the Neolithic. So one of the innovations is the domestication of cereals and also pulses, so the domestication of plants. The other is the domestication of animals, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. And that is how that is what allowed for people to lead a sedentary lifestyle. So they didn't have to hunt, they didn't have to move, they could stay put in one place. And another trait of the Neolithic package is sedentism. Also, pottery was invented during the Neolithic. I mean, it wasn't invented, but we are simplifying things here. So this is all simplified. So pottery was also invented during the Neolithic, and now people have had different firm containers to store foods, to cook foods. And to not so much to transport them, but it's mostly for cooking and storage. And it is durable. Also, during this time, polished stone tools were created, polished stone tools like axes, adzes, chisels, and grinding stones. And everything that happened during the Neolithic was followed by new ideology, and ideology that had to follow all of these innovations and this different lifestyle that emerged in the Middle East. So this Neolithic package, after it was formed and after people lived for several millennia in the Near East in this way, they started moving and they moved to Europe. So that is how they populated migrants from the Middle East, how they populated Europe and Central Balkans as well. So with them, they brought their Neolithic package, their innovations, and these domesticated cereals and domesticated animals. So in this presentation, we're going to see how wild cereals differed from the domestic ones and how this process looked like at the territory of Central Balkans. So if there are some differences between early and late Neolithic and how different foodstuffs, how different food types were made from cereals, so most importantly bread, and how some of these food items can be used in order to brand the Neolithic tradition. So just one example. So cereal domestication, as I've said, lasted for several thousand years. And it all began during the last glacial maximum when these fields of wild grasses emerged at the territory of the Fertile Crescent. So those grasses had some grains and people saw, oh, we can use them in our diet, we can eat them. So they started experimenting. And this is for, as I've said, for wheat, barley, oats, and rye. Those are the Near Eastern cereals. There are different types of cereals. Rice is also a cereal. Corn is also a cereal, but it is not native to these lands, and we do not have those traditions that were carried through the Neolithic in these territories. So because it's mostly corn after Christopher Columbus and everything and so on and so forth. So for those several millennia, people saw different traits that can be improved from their viewpoint. Wild grains, so here we can see the illustration of differences between wild and domesticated acorn wheat. So wild wheats, they have these brittle rachis. Rachis is the central part that holds spicklets together, and spicklets hold grain. So in these wild specimens, we have those brittle rachis, and when those grains are mature and they're heavy, those rachis break, and those grains, they scatter on the ground. And that is how they ensure the reproduction for the next year. But people saw that some of the specimens had more firm rachis and had bigger grains. And that were some of the characteristics that were beneficial to them, because then they do not have to collect all those grains that were scattered around the ground. They can just sow the entire stem and to have all of those grains together. And also that is how and by selecting bigger grains, they had more food. And by selecting those traits for generations and generations, they created domesticated cereals that now became dependent on the human. They could not reproduce on their own. They needed humans in order to sow them. That is how the agriculture was created. So that is the beginning of the agriculture. And in those changes, some morphophysiological traits occurred, and now we have different types of cereals, and by selecting them and changing their other traits, now we have so many variations of different wheats and barley. Okay, just a second. I can use yours.
Yes.
Okay, so wild cereals are adapted for natural survival and seed dispersal, while domesticated cereals are adapted for human harvesting and higher food production. And this is simplified scheme from ChatGPT, so this is not actually anything. This is not, Neolithic tools, but just to see how this process went. So everything started with cultivation. This is the process of domesticated emmer wheat, which is early domesticated wheat, and it had different traits than some of the cereals today, but this was the Neolithic, typical Neolithic wheat type. So cultivation started by land clearance in order to create fields, then sowing by hand, sowing those seeds from previous year. Then we had a harvest, which was done by cutting those stems of these cereals with flint sickles, and then bundling them and leaving them to dry a bit. Then we had the phase of thrashing. Thrashing is beating or trampling with wooden sticks. It is to separate spicklets from those rachis, because now they are firm and we have to separate them. Then these early triticum species, these early wheats and barleys were hulled wheat, hulled cereals, which means they had glooms around their grains, and glooms are not digestible by humans, so they had to separate them. And this is the husking phase, when you are doing pounding and crushing in order to remove glooms from those grains. And then we had the winnowing, which is by removing chaff from grains in the wind to ensure, that only the pure grain remains. After then, you can store that, or you can grind them on grinding stone, not like this one. This is not a Neolithic grinding stone, in order to produce flour. And then you can consume. Then we have the consumption, which is, making some porridge, gruel, or bread. And now what happens at the Central Balkans? When the people from the Middle East, Near Eastern migrants that come at the beginning of at this 6,250 years ago, when they come to the Central Balkan territory, they come to the new territory, completely new territory. And they bring those cereals, goats and sheep that do not have wild predecessors at this territory. So these cereals and these animal taxa, goats and sheep, do not have relatives, wild relatives. But cattle and pigs, they do have wild relatives in this territory. So this is the first time that the Mediterranean people and Mediterranean plants and animals come to the temperate climate. And this is a problem because they have to adjust. They have to adjust to new conditions. So in the early Neolithic, we see that because we have settlements that are not completely sedentary. Their architecture, they lived early Neolithic cultural communities. They lived inside semi-subterranean dwellings or in the above ground dwellings, but those dwellings did not have permanent fixtures. And we do see less indicators of sedentary lifestyle than after and then in the Middle East. So we do have cereals, we do have evidence that cereals were consumed and that they were sown during the early Neolithic, but not so much. And we do not have those goats and sheep. They had to adjust their reproductive cycles. So we do not have the dependence, economical dependence on these two animal taxa. But we do have greater dependence on cattle because they had their predecessors at these territories. And even though pigs also had their wild predecessors here, we do not have a huge reliance on pigs because pigs are the indicators for sedentary lifestyle. They're not suitable for movable lifestyle. So in the late Neolithic, we see huge differences than in the previous periods. So in the late Neolithic winter culture communities, they built permanent above ground houses made in wetland dog technique with firm furniture that is fixed. So we have fixed storage, fixed ovens, grinding stones that are also fixed into the floor of the house. We see more reliance on cereals, and we do have new taxa new cereal taxa that have been developed during the late Neolithic and that have been consumed. For example, those now we have naked grain, so we do not have whole grain. So now the husking part can be, for some of the taxa, can be just excluded because you don't need that. For some of them still, yes. We have everything that is needed for that. We have more reliance on sheep and goat. We have more reliance on cattle and on pigs. So more reliance on domesticates altogether than in the previous periods, because then a huge portion of the economy of diet was based also on wild animals. And what are some of the products that can be made from cereals? So beer, of course, porridge, yes. Bulgur, that is type of meal that you get. I mean, it is first you boil cereals and then you dry them and then you grind them because they have prolonged shelf life. Then they're less prone to spoilage and to rodent and insect infestation. Trahananas is one typical Mediterranean dish that could have been also consumed during the Neolithic of the Central Balkans. And it is when you cook cereals in milk and then you form them into some bowls and then you dry those bowls. And after that, you can store them. That also improves their shelf life. So you can then, when you want to eat them, you just cook them and you can eat them with cheese or whatever you want. And in the end, we have bread, which is the staple food even today in the most parts of the world. So now let's talk about bread. So the oldest bread did not come from domesticated cereals. It predates the domestication of cereals, and it was made from wild cereals. The oldest bread was found at the site of Shubaika 1 in Jordan, and it is 14,400 to 14,200 years old. And it was found in these hearts, in these dwellings you can see over here. So they had semi-subterranean buildings that had basalt flagstone they were paved with basalt flagstones, and they had sunken hearts inside in the center, and they were also lined with basalt flagstones. So inside these hearts remains carbonate bread remains were found. So the picture, like in a toaster that you get those carbonate breadcrumbs, that something like that was found inside these hearts. They were analyzed, and it was concluded that they belong to unleavened flat bread-like products. 24 samples were collected and analyzed, and they show typical traces of cereals, acorn wheat, wild acorn wheat. But 5 samples also show traces typical for root type starch, club tuber, that is tuber that is native to the Fertile Crescent region. So, which means that not only simple bread was made from one cereal, but they combined different plant-based foods. In the Neolithic layers of Çatalhöyük is a site that is located in central Turkey. Bread was also found and analyzed, so bread remains, carbonized bread remains, and it was concluded that they were made from unleavened flat bread that was made from cereals with starchy sage tubers, most likely something similar to the Jordan ones, and coarsely ground pulses like lentil and bitter vetch, and small wild mustard seeds. So it was a meal. It was not just loaf of bread. It was really complex, a complex pastry, let's call it like that. So in the Central Balkans, we do not have these types of evidence like bread remains, because this methodology has been recently developed, and we still haven't found them, or we found them, but we didn't take them for analysis, didn't sample them. So we are hoping to have those samples in future, but there are all the evidence for bread consumption in the Central Balkan Neolithic. We have grinding stones, we have cereals, we have ovens, we have everything that we need in order to produce bread, and we know that bread was made even from wild cereals, so why not? And now, because we are talking about creative industries and how cultural heritage can be used in order to promote certain traditions, now I'm going to show you one example that comes from Turkey, how something simple became something exclusive. So Taştepeler sites are located in southeast Turkey, next to the Urfa city of Urfa, and that's next to Syrian border. And in those sites those are several dozen sites that were created that belong to early Neolithic phases. So they all were immersed around Haram Plain that was rich in wild cereal fields during the beginning of Holocene. And some of the oldest Neolithic settlements come from this region. They're really magnificent, like Karahan Tepe, Göbekli Tepe, Sayburç, Sefer Tepe, and all of those sites that are from the initial phases of Neolithic that predate pottery. So that is why they are called pre-pottery Neolithic. And during this phase, we do have grinding stone, we do have polished stone tools, we do have sedentary lifestyle, but we do not have pottery, we do not have domesticated wheat or grains, we do not have domesticated animals. During the first stages, early stages, pre-pottery Neolithic A, the plant domestication is ongoing, and in the pre-pottery Neolithic B, that domestication process is finished, and now the animal domestication process is ongoing. So this is the formation of Neolithic. Now we have the formation of new ideology that we can see in these public buildings that are really impressive. So it is an impressive story, and it is really spectacular. And Turkish Airlines used that. So they branded the oldest bread in the world. They made some loaves that are like, trust me, bro, they're really the original bread that was created and that was consumed in the early Neolithic of the southeastern Turkey. And they offered this bread, they packed it in those fancy bags, and then they offer it to business class international flight passengers since the September of 2024. So, and they have that story of Tashtapelar, story of this beginning of Neolithic and the cradle of Neolithic. They have that story in their ads and on their site. And it is really how inexpensive product, simple product, by packaging it fancy and by telling this really interesting story, it becomes something exclusive and something luxurious. So that is something that we can have in mind to think about different products and this intangible heritage, and something like, yeah, bread or yeah, porridge. Now you can brand it in some sort of way and it becomes something completely different. So thank you for your attention.